Hello, it's great to have you with us again. My name is Dan Brook. I'm a retired academic and clergy from Hudson, Wisconsin. This is another segment in Different Voices, Shared Vision. It's a celebration, really, of the fact that participants on our panel are made up of three of the five major religions of the world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in the conversations we've had in the past, if you've watched them, you have come to appreciate, as all of us have, that we have much more in common than the things that separate us. And the conversations we have had have always taught each of us more than we knew before. And so we're grateful for the opportunity to share that kind of a conversation with you this evening. I'll let each of the panel members introduce themselves. And we'll start today with Mr. Wertheimer. Sorry about that. We're next door neighbors, and you know how the brain always leaves you down just when you need it the most. Rob Wertheimer. And he is a member of the Jewish faith, and they're in the midst of celebrating Passover right now. So I've asked him to just briefly share a little bit with us what the Passover is all about. So, Rob.
Thank you. I'm Rob Wertheimer. I live in Hudson. I'm a lawyer in downtown Hudson. Grew up in New York City. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. And we are in the midst of celebrating Passover. And basically, in a nutshell, it's in Exodus, and it's the story of the freeing of the Jews from slavery in Egypt. They were slaves, and Moses, first of all, the Egyptians were worried about having too many Jews in their land, that they were going to take over and become more populous than the Egyptians, and so he had an order out for killing all the male Jews, and Moses was sent adrift and saved from that edict and was actually raised within the Pharaoh's walls. He grew up. He, I think, intervened with someone in the palace killing a Jewish slave and went in hiding, came out of hiding, and God told him to help, basically anointed him as a leader to help free the Jews. And Moses went to the Pharaoh and asked him to free the Jews, and he wouldn't. And God had instructed him that he would bring plagues upon the houses of Egypt. And each time, there were 10 plagues, and none of the plagues worked until the final one, which was the killing of the firstborn. And once that began, the king said that the Jews could go, but they had to go in an awful hurry. In addition, Passover comes from the homes of the Jews had lamb's blood, put lamb's blood above the doorway, and that told the angel of death to pass over their homes. And so those firstborn were not killed. And so the Jews, after that 10th plague began, were told that they could leave, but they had to leave in an awful hurry. They couldn't even wait for the bread to rise, which is why we celebrate the freeing of the Jews from Egyptian slavery with matzah, which is unleavened bread. It's the flat bread like a cracker that is made without the bread being risen, and we commemorate the freedom from Egypt as slaves. So we were once slaves, and we celebrate that freedom, and we left Egypt, and it's a very actually happy holiday. So happy holidays.
And do you celebrate Passover yourself? Have any special things that you do during these days?
There's a Seder. The first 2 nights you have a special dinner which commemorates the plagues, as well as that we were slaves unto Egypt and we were freed, and you go through, it's actually a fairly long evening of commemorating that. There's a prayer book called a Haggadah, and you sit down and tell the story of the slavery and the freedom of the Jewish people. And it always ends with next year in Jerusalem, which is about being in the homeland, and that we would be free and be able to go there.
So when you were a child, did your mother have this Seder meal during this time?
Yes, and there's a thing where there's a part of the Seder where you ask one of the things is asking the 4 questions, like why is this night different from all other nights, and a couple others. And the youngest child in the home gets to do that, and since I was an only child, I got to do it all the time. So my memories, but
so you had good memories of this.
Yes, it was like I said, it was a happy holiday, and you also got prizes. We would hide a piece of matzah called the afikomen. That would be hidden, and if you found it, you got a prize, and it was a happy time. Yes.
You know, I'd ask a question. Someone said to me once that the Passover nationally is akin to our 4th of July. It's the independence, it's the freedom from England and the oppression of the king, and there's some parallels there. How do you respond to that?
That's interesting. I haven't heard that before. I guess it's somewhat similar, yes. Yeah. Although we were pretty much lost peoples for a while after that. We didn't just start our own country with a constitution immediately. But yes, it's very much akin
independence celebration.
Yeah, definitely.
Becoming your own people
and not being. Yeah.
I just wondered what you thought of that.
That's an interesting thought. Yes, I hadn't heard that before.
Well, thanks, Rob. You should know, those of you who are watching, that we put Rob on the spot. He really didn't know he was going to be harassed in that way. So we're grateful for sharing the info with all of us and learning for all of us. And then the person next to you who asked the question is Dean Simpson, pastor, used to be at Roberts, now at Eau Claire, and a real scholar of the Christian faith.
A Lutheran in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, serving at Grace Lutheran Church in Eau Claire. Just been there a little over a year, almost a year and a half now. But we still live here in St. Croix County and get to associate with these fine gentlemen whom I'm getting to know with greater and greater appreciation all the time. It's been a rich conversation. I'm happy to be here today.
It's good to have you here. And Askan is from Turkey originally, grew up a Muslim, although spent time in Germany, now lives in River Falls, and I'll let you introduce the rest of yourself.
Thank you. I'm Askan Kilic, and I live in River Falls right now for 11 years. Prior to joining the University of Wisconsin here, I used to work in Turkey as a professor in marketing. Prior to that, I grew up in Germany, as you said, and spent my childhood in Germany, went back to Turkey. I was a child of a Gastarbeiter family, and we had our issues in Germany at that time, but only good memories. So I'm pretty much international in this regard. But right now I call River Falls and Wisconsin as home. So I'm glad to be here with my friends and brothers, and I'm always excited to talk about an interesting topic, and we'll see how it's going to turn out tonight. Thank you.
You know, Turkey is in the news quite a bit these days, both with the immigrants that are going through it and associated mischief. How does the international press, do you think, are they dealing truthfully with the situation in Turkey from your point of view? I know you spend every summer there, or often do.
So we go every summer, and I remember a couple of years ago when really Assad pushed back his people and started to killing in masses. There was a huge push towards the eastern border in Turkey, and I was in Istanbul, and I saw lots of families. There was no really shelter. They were living literally under the bridges, and with small kids, and they were just begging. They were beggars, and they really didn't have anything, and I felt so sorry for them. So what happened, emotional and touch, what happened that year, I think was 2 years ago, they made them go back to the eastern part and establish some cities. I mean, it's literally just tents they build up, and so just emergency type of shelters. I think it's roughly 3,000 almost right now, and frankly, if you ask me, I don't think that Turkey in general has been treated fairly in the regard of how open they are to welcome these refugees with limited resources. And there are issues with the European Union and Turkey going on. I don't know about the details, but as far as I can follow, they spend billions of dollars annually from the Turkish government and doesn't get any support. And I believe they ask for some money. Now, Europe thinks they shouldn't give the money. That's how I perceive it. And it's really a tough call for Turkey. And right now, they have been stricter. I believe they closed the borders. The reason is not just the refugees, but there's lots of terrorists coming. They can't really control, and that's one of the reasons there was 3-4 terrorist attacks done by ISIS, by Daesh. They call it Daesh, and it's really terrible, and it's harming the Turkish security and also threatening Europe as well. So something has to be done, and I don't know. There's different parameters I don't know of, but I would say it's a difficult situation for each and every of us, where I would say Turkey should have a greater saying in what's going to happen, but that's not the case right now, because no one likes the president right now in Turkey. That's what it is, I believe. I mean, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's probably a good segue into the discussion that we intend to have today. If you've watched us before, you may have already caught on that sometimes our intended discussion sort of morphs into a different discussion that usually ends up being better than we intended anyway. But our intention today is to discuss the relationship that each of our religions has with government, or their opinions about the appropriate relationship between religion and the government. And the reason we bring that forward at this time is because even in our own country, there's been almost such a, what would I say, an increasingly close relationship in many cases between religion and politics and government, and it's kind of hard to sort out really what our religions say about certain things and what the government says about certain things, and whether they're antagonistic to each other or in cahoots with each other. And I thought one of the topics that might be a good way to, or subtopics to introduce this general topic, is something that I'm sort of dumping on our panel too unexpectedly, and that is about a decade ago, as my memory serves me. There was a book written that coined the phrase, or talked about the myth of redemptive violence. And the title interested me because I really had no clue what it was all about. But the basic concept of redemptive, well, let me back up before I define it a little bit. The major overview of the author of this text was that all the major religions of the world, particularly he mentioned Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are really not the major religions of the world. There is only one major religion of the world, and that is the worship of violence, which has permeated all of the major religions of the world. So if you were to kind of define redemptive violence, it's the belief that you can have peace through war, that you can have security through strength, that might makes right, that war brings out the heroic in us, that it's a good discipline, even though we all know, and I'll be interested to see what our panelists say, about the fact that in reality the evils of war and violence far outweigh the virtues of it. Because we know that violence almost always results in greater violence. Jesus, from the Christian point of view, simply was making a false statement when he said, "Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord," if redemptive violence is a reality. But we know that war always causes divisions, plants seeds of future war. All of these people have experienced that to one degree or another. It always brings out the worst in humanity far more often than it brings out the best. It often corrupts far more than it purifies. And the overwhelming thing about war is that it is always ends up being the greater evil rather than the greater good. And I just ask you to remember the phrases of war to end all wars, which in fact didn't end all wars, but started many others, and the war to make the world safe for democracy, which isn't happening at all. In fact, it ruined our ability to see democracy grow in some areas. So the whole point of it is that war multiplies every other evil. It raises hatred, cruelty, suffering, famine, torture, whatever, you name it. And so the entree really to talk about how our religions and our governments coexist from the point of view of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Maybe the vehicle to address that through is what our views of violence are, each of the three major religions' views of violence are, and how that comports with our relationship with the government. Now that may be a complicated sentence, so let's start with the lawyer, should we? Because lawyers are trained to understand complicated things. Is that okay, Rob?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so Judaism and violence, basically, and the justification of war.
Yeah. How does your faith? Where does it place violence in the broad scheme of your understanding of how humans are to relate to one another?
Well, I guess I'd start with the Ten Commandments, and I don't believe, just on that regard, that it's a strong, it's obviously promoting, to not murder, to treat your neighbors, you treat yourself, to do the right thing. And so I don't think that it's a promoter of violence as a greater good. On the other hand, there's so much in the Jewish history about, fighting their way out of the predicaments they've been in and defending themselves. So I believe you're allowed to defend yourself, but I don't think that, they're the starters of war, that they, obviously you don't have to, the traditional Old Testament's an eye for an eye, but I don't believe that it's more of a self-defense. I don't think it's grand, it's making war the correct thing to do in most cases, but it's also not to let yourself get trampled over either. I think generally as the religion has progressed on and more into the late 19th and 20th century, I think they're taking a different view, depending on whether you're talking about Israel as Judaism or just Judaism in the West. There's also very different views with that as far as the Jews in Israel, it's always seen as this survival mechanism, that in order for Israel to survive, it needs to be strong. It needs to have a giant military. The U.S. has obviously backed them since its creation. And that's one of the things about Israel, is that you don't mess with Israel because they're tough and they're strong, and this strength, and they'll go to war if they need to, or they'll attack if they need to. Whereas a lot of the Jews in America are probably, especially in the 60s and 70s and into this century, are anti-war on any costs. And so there's a real dichotomy within our own religion as to what we've progressed to today, depending on where you're sitting. So it's a diverse view. I myself am pretty pro-peace. I do believe there's some wars that are just and needed to happen, especially World War II. Being a child of a Holocaust survivor, we had to stop Hitler, we had to stop fascists in Italy and Japan, and it was needed to be done, or we would have lost all of our freedoms and where we'd be sitting today. So I personally am not a big fan of any violence or any war, although I realize that at some points it has to be done because there's no other alternative.
Okay, Dean, how would you describe the relationship between Christianity, or the basic Christian beliefs about violence, and its relationship with government or governments?
Yeah, it's such a complex question. And Jesus talked, at the peak of his, I suppose, what he valued and taught was the love even of one's enemies. Quoting Torah, he said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, and seem to take this sort of authority, one would think, over Torah, saying, love your enemies, and so on. Now, what's interesting about that for me is that Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jewish teacher. And he was speaking as teacher, as rabbi. And I don't know the history of the teaching of other rabbis on this. I'm sure Jesus was not completely unique in that. So I think there would be a stream within Judaism and within the rabbis that Jesus would side with, and some of the prophets and so on. So I think this reminds me of one other time when we did touch on this, and we all agreed that nobody's in favor of violence, and that you cannot establish peace through violence. And yet the example of the Holocaust and the righteousness of that cause, when you've got a mad dog attacking, and you're not going to stand by and let others be slaughtered. And so you take up the sword in defense of the neighbor and so on. And we justify that out of some supposed necessity. However, to think that that establishes actual peace, shalom, would be a mistake. It doesn't establish peace, and peace can never be established through violence, because the old idea of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is, you knock out my tooth, and when I go to knock out your tooth, chances are I'll knock out two if I can. I mean, the perceived offense against me is always greater than you. If you're the one offending me, you don't think it was that big a deal. I think it's a huge deal. And so I come back even stronger, and then you take that offense as way, way outweighing what you deserved, and then you come back at me. And so this idea of eye for an eye and tooth for tooth doesn't quite work. So Jesus wants to stop all of that. And I think one of the real values that New Testament theologians are lifting up today is, against the myth of redemptive violence, is the power of redemptive suffering. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to be willing to endure some offense, endure some suffering, in order for the cycle of violence to end. And that sounds risky, and indeed it is. However, striking back to take out the offender's tooth, who's knocked out our tooth, is also very risky. And as we've seen in history, it accelerates violence. So here's the bottom line for me. We can argue as Scripture scholars or whatever we want on the basis of trying to think clearly and rationally, and when violence would be justified and so on. But then if you look at history, at what actually happens, I'm confusing myself here a little bit. It makes sense to strike back. We can argue for that and defend that idea. But if you look at history, it doesn't work. It actually promotes more thirst for revenge on the part of the people we struck back we think justifiably. But it doesn't end there, because now they're waiting for their turn. And so I think history really needs to be taken into account, not just logic and good reasoning, but what I think Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, clearly saw is it does not work. Revenge and the myth of redemptive violence is exactly that, a myth. It's an empty lie, and it leads to more violence. So Jesus, a Jewish teacher and revered in Islam, teaches us suffer. suffer innocently for the sake of bringing peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. And I think that is the highest pinnacle of Christian teaching, and I'm under no illusion that there's any of us who are living up to it. But there it is from the lips of the one we call the Lord. So
Oscar.
When you so framing a behavior that prevents evil, that prevents violence as violence, and violence itself should be separated. But what do I mean by that? I, as a person, I'm not allowed to be violent. I can't be violent. That's against my religious belief and against the human nature. So violence in general should be condemned. That's how I feel about it. So I don't have the right to be unjust and violent and do something bad to someone else. Neither does the government have the right to be unjust to his people, to its people, to any other group, whatever it is. So being violent, so framing the word of violence should be, maybe we should be more clear about what is violence. Is violence any unjust behavior, putting pressure, elimination, doing suffering on others? What is violence? Maybe we should agree on that. So I think as an individual and as a government, we don't have that right. So redemptive violence in this regard is not an issue. It's not in my vocabulary. It's not there. But what if, right now, I as a person, and in all these religious beliefs, eye for eye, tooth for teeth, I have the right to behave in the act of self-defense, right? But I can't be violent. What does it mean? If you strike me, I have the right to defend me, but I can't be as violent as you are. If I'm violent as you are, then I'm no different than you are, right? But I still have the right to defend myself, don't I? At least to hold my guard or whatever, to hide, to run away, right? I do have that right. So I also have the right maybe to strike back. But in Quran it says, it's better that when you forgive, you have the right. For example, if Moses, right, he killed someone, God forgave him. But the relatives of whom he killed had the right for retaliation, right? But God says it's better if you forgive in this regard. So when I look from this perspective, I as a person don't have the right to be violent, neither the government. So the government has the duty to protect me from that violence. The duty to prevent him to strike me or whatever. If he struck me, to punish him. So the right to punish as a government entity is different than being violent. That's how I perceive it. So if the government sees me and tries to punish him because he did unjust, it is punishment. That it's something different. Where the government does it, not I as the individual. I don't have that right. The government does it if it's in protection of the people. So we go to what Israel does to a certain degree. I don't agree, but to a certain degree, it is right. Because if someone attacks you, you have to. And now look what happens in Syria. Assad is killing his own people. He is violent, more than violent, he's barbaric. Or Daesh is killing innocent people, they're barbaric. Shouldn't we stop them? Would that be perceived as being violent against them? Or against Assad? I don't. If I do it as an individual and go, and I don't have the right, but there should be a government or a united whatever platform that should take care of that on my own behalf, but not being violent. It doesn't mean that you punish it the same way. They should first be prevented from doing bad, and then justice should be practiced. Now we go to the relationship with the government. If the government is just, it's a legal, legitimate government. If not, it's not legitimate, period. According to Islam, a Muslim and anyone else has to obey a government as long as they're just. If there's unjust, if there's a violence, you're not required to obey. So, because the government's duties, responsibilities, and our rights as people, I just transitioned to your topic, I'm sorry, is the government is to be just and protect their people. And the people have the right to live, to prosper, to grow, proliferate, to travel. That is our right and can only be secured by a government. If the government is doing well, I obey. A Muslim is required to obey. It doesn't matter. I'm not talking about Islamic. I'm talking about government, right? Government. So what it means, a government, as long as government is doing that, there's no problem to obey, no problem to follow. But as soon as the government is doing the opposite, it's not representing the people, and no one is required to obey. Like Assad's, the example is there. So now I don't want to get political, but now he calls his people terrorists, but he is exercising violence. So what is that relationship? It's not people-government anymore, right? So one more thing. The people, a Muslim, are free to choose their government. And they're free to elect their officials. They're free to criticize their officials. And they are obligated to scrutinize their officials. So, because there's a shura in Islam. And either you elect people to that shura, it could be a parliament, a congress, whatever, who in behalf of you are scrutinizing whoever is governing. So, and this is what the Quran says about the relationship between people and the government. It doesn't say Muslim, it says people. It's people. So that's fair. So I was so what is it really defining? And I want to go a step further and take the risk of being criticized. It is defining democracy as we want it really. So again, we have the right to choose, we elect, we scrutinize, and we are criticizing. And if the government is not protecting us, is not just, is violent, we're obligated to be against that government and vote for someone else. So the only here, zalim, it says zalim, tyrant, crueler, a cruel ruler either steps down or so it's, doesn't deserve to be there. So that's what it is. And one thing is, that's,
So the question is, when does a government become unjust? And we have disagreements about that, all of us in this country right now. Some people think the Obama group is, the worst thing that's ever happened to this country. Others see him as one of the greatest presidents we've ever seen. And so I agree that we stand against tyranny, we stand against unjust governments. We've got a lawyer here. When does a government become unjust?
Well, that's
and
the
how does
question.
that? Yeah,
how do you determine that?
Yeah, I once saw a program, and the judge said, "I must remind you, this is not a court of justice; it's a court of law." Exactly. And we have to try to establish just laws. Good luck on getting agreement about that. But one thing we don't want to, we want to vote. We don't want to just start an armed rebellion and resort to violence.
Vote, sure.
And yet we don't seem to be able to stop ourselves from being violent, which is
that personally, we're not allowed. We can't be violent.
Yeah.
That according to what I believe.
But you would not define self-defense, even armed self-defense, as violence. So again, it's difficult even agreeing on what violence is sometimes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I as a person can execute justice. if violence is defined as as make people suffer in a way that they don't deserve, I mean, people don't deserve to suffer. So if you make them suffer, you're violent. Period. So, but if someone did some unjust and has testified that, yes, I did kill this person, for example. So what to do with that? So the person's family has a right to ask for justice, right? Or not? I don't know.
Yeah, well, they do have the right.
Yeah.
I mean, de facto, we do have that right. But the Quran says it's better to forgive.
Yes, that's right. And that is tough.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to break in a second and take us back to the beginning, something we probably should have addressed initially. Do all of your faiths recognize that government in the first place is placed there as an instrument of God's work and will? That the government is something that God wants God's people to have. And if that is a basic agreement, then how does God, from the perspective of your faith, see the proper role of government, which you've been talking about?
In the New Testament, again, I think the witness is divided. You've got Paul arguing that God has established whatever governments there are in Romans 13. And yet in Acts we have the example of Peter and the others being ordered to be silent by the governing authorities, and them answering, well, if it's right in the sight of God to obey human beings or to obey God, you must decide, but as far as we're concerned, we must obey God. And so there is sometimes apparently the obligation, spiritual obligation, to stand against governments, even if you believe they've been instituted by God, when you believe you're standing for justice, God's justice. So it's you can't. I think that it's important to understand, from our point of view as Christians, you can't simply go to the Bible and say, well, here's the answer.
Okay.
Here's what the Scripture says, because the Scripture says two things. And the responsibility is done back on us to ask, what is really the right thing to do? Not what is my right, but what would establish the peace of God here? And then daring to act for that, whether you think it's picking up a sword, a gun, or whether you think it's offering your life as a martyr, and trusting your destiny to God, according to the example of Jesus. So again, I just have to say, you may decide either way based on the circumstances of the moment. In our Lutheran past, we have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who really struggled with this, who stood against Hitler and got implicated, and he was guilty in a plot to kill Hitler that failed, and he ended up in prison and being executed. But before that, as a pastor, dealing with soldiers being called to fight in Hitler's army, some were conscientious objectors, and he would bless them, hear their confession, forgive them, serve them communion. And there were other soldiers who thought it was their duty to go fight, even though they thought it was unjust, but as good Germans being ordered to do that, they thought they should go, and Bonhoeffer would bless them as they go to serve in the way that they thought. And so I don't know what all he said to them, but he really struggled with this question of the legitimacy of government. And it's just not clear. The answer is not there clearly in the Bible. If it were, Christians would agree with it, and they don't. So I think someone said once, the Bible is not there to give us, to answer all our questions. It's rather there to question our answers. and the examples and the teachings of the Bible turn it around on us and say, well, what kind of world do you want to create through your words and your actions? And what do you think will be the outcome of this? And God, it's almost like God makes us responsible. We keep wanting to say, oh, God's responsible. We got to do what God says, but we don't know what God says, and God seems to have handed it over to us to say, we are in the place of responsibility, and exactly. we're making decisions for God here. Yes. So it really is in our laps, and we may be called upon to suffer innocently on behalf of the cause of peace in the world.
So I'm going to take an even greater risk than Oscan did and try to sort of focus in the minutes we have remaining on the current state of affairs in our own country, our own government that is facing a transition in the midst of an election where you hear all sorts of voices being raised, not only political voices, but media voices and religious voices. And so I would ask your opinion on whether or not you think any of our religions are speaking to the conflicted issues that we've been talking about, the no simple answers, but the call for each of us to think very deeply about how we as citizens live and speak and act in this culture, and whether or not it's in a manner consistent with the faiths we confess. Where do you think we are right now in terms of coming to grips with just this kind of question?
I think, I'll start.
Good.
You know, I was thinking about our getting together here and how we do this, you know, every, whatever, 3-4 months. And just, it seems like since we started this for a while, things were plodding along. It seems like, especially with this last election cycle, that it's actually gotten worse as far as, especially in our country. I mean, with Donald Trump and just his calling out of Mexicans and Muslims and just, and then, you know, the other candidates on his side of the political spectrum calling for other types of segregationist type of things. It's just, it doesn't seem like it's getting any better. And then we're having this whole bathroom controversy, and it's just crazy. It's kind of like a diversion away from really what's wrong with our country. And rather than trying to bring everyone together, it appears like we're trying to separate each other into, you know, I'm disgruntled with our system, so I'm going to vote for you because you understand me. I can relate to you because you want to, you know, you want to build a wall and keep America great and keep everyone else out who's ruining our country. And it's just, you know, it's hearkening back to the 1800s. So it's quite disturbing, and I really don't think it follows any of our religions here to isolate the stranger and the other and to say they're different from us and we need to keep them out and we need to stop them. And it just harkens, I don't think it's good. It really, it's upsetting, and it's a cause for concern.
Yeah. Do you think any of the religious leaders from the local parish priest, pastor, or rabbi up to bishops and archbishops and even the Pope in the case of Catholicism are speaking directly to this, setting a moral stage for the people who listen to them to have an opportunity to think about it even?
I think the Pope has done a really fine job, and in this regard, I think he is switching the conversation to a more fruitful area. I think there's a good argument to be made that a lot of our violence is caused by our lust for more and more, and our sense that our sense of entitlement to this little bubble of peace and plenty that I ought to be able to live in. I ought to be able to burn as much fossil fuel and buy as much crap and spend my money any way I want. And so our material success has become our failure. It's undermined our sense of community and our sense of responsibility for one another. Our consumerism and our insistence on the right to pursue this crazy materialistic lifestyle has made us more warlike and more violent with each other, more afraid of each other, more suspicious of one another and separated from one another. And in defense of this way of life that we think is the American way of life, we're willing to go to war, protect our oil interests and our trade interests and so on. And the Pope is helping us to see this, helping us to see how our wealth has undermined our spiritual health and well-being, and we need to return to more of an emphasis on community, on neighborliness, on the things that make life really worth living, not just defending our right to pile up more stuff and claim more territory for ourselves. So I think he's being helpful in refocusing the conversation in more peaceful ways.
So I wish that the Muslim scholars here in the United States had their fair share of contributing to this discussion, but I don't think, I'm not a Muslim scholar, I'm just a Muslim, so I can't speak really in detail about, because I'm not an expert. That would really enrich the discussion of what needs to be done in order to create a better, peaceful society. So I feel that in this regard, the Muslim faith and the thought process has been neglected here. They don't have any saying because they already have been marginalized as the terrorists. I was shocked, and I will give a name, maybe it's to listen on CNN that a contributor says all Sunni Muslims are potential terrorists. This person said that on CNN, and no one said, I don't want to give the other name, but I was shocked. So if you marginalize all the Muslims already, then we don't have any saying to this, right? We don't contribute because we're all terrorists already. And this is the shocking aspect for me. It's sad, it's threatening, it's frightening, whatever you want to say it. And it was on CNN a few months back.
Yeah.
I know the guy's name who said that, a young whatever expert. I don't know what makes him an expert. I don't know. He just said that. All Sunni Muslims are potential terrorists to be recruited by ISIS. That's what he said. So if you say that, then you already have excluded all the Muslims here in the United States, either being immigrants or being born here, converted to Islam, whatever it is, you have already excluded. So if you exclude this from this equation, how do you want to solve things?
You know, Özkan, you said something a little earlier before we started this taped conversation about the danger of ignorance and how vulnerable we are to this kind of nonsense because we don't know one another. And, you know, you hear some talking head on TV saying all Sunnis are potential terrorists. You say, oh my goodness, we better be careful because I don't know. But I'm getting to know Özkan,
thank you.
You know, and
that's
I don't see you as a potential terrorist, Özkan.
This group is an evidence that this can be done.
Yeah.
And besides you, we're not scholars in Islam. We're not, but we're just regular Jewish, Muslim, and you're a scholar. So we can get together, and I'm sure that if we bring in real scholars that know about their faith, from the Islamic perspective, that would be even more enriching all this discussion, but it can't be done because we're all already marginalized. And this the couple of what you mentioned about these politicians, they already have condemned the Muslims here. And this is what makes me really sad, and I still have hope. The reason I have hope, because my hope is in God, right? That's what it is. And He knows better than I do. And it will go and flow into the whatever it has to go. And
I love that, Özkan. I was reading Thomas Berry's book last night, The Sacred Universe. He's dead now, and this came from the 70s, but he made a comment that now we have a global context for all of our lives. More and increasingly, we're aware of people around the world and how what we do affects them. And that's new in history, that this really global context is developing as part of human consciousness. And therefore, he says, each of us in our own religious tradition have to think about it and act it out in a global context. Now, he says, it's very important for each of us to deepen and continue to develop our own religious tradition. But we have to do that in a vital relationship with other traditions, because we have to now act and think in a more global context. And so there are people in the world who are different than us, think differently, act and relate to God differently, and we need to respect that and learn about one another. Even as we deepen in our own tradition in the deepest values that really unite us, humanitarian values, justice and compassion, truth and so on. So it doesn't mean I stop being a Christian. It means I become a better Christian, and I want you to help me be a better Christian so that you can be a better Jew and a better Muslim and Hindus and Buddhists and Native Americans and all the rest. So the human being, the human community, the planet itself needs our attention, and peace and justice are values that we all share.
Yeah, I mean, again, we are in minority, the four of us here right now. We're but being minority doesn't really scare me, actually, because I think we're doing the right thing.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I've noted that our hour has crept by unusually quickly. The thought just crossed my mind as I'm listening to this conversation that maybe we ought to expand it to a more public setting and see if there's any interest at all in us meeting at a place like the Phipps or some public arena, and open the discussion to others who might want to join in. So as you're watching this, if this is something that might interest you, please call this the good folks here at Community Television and give them your opinions on it. In the meanwhile, we're really grateful for your presence with us. We hope you have caught a feeling for the complexity of many issues that are thrust upon us in a complicated world like this, where our religions can offer us advice, counsel, encouragement, and increased desire to work toward the betterment of all. To that end, we again offer you our thanks for being present with us. Let us know how you think we're doing, and thank you so much to all of you on the panel. As we're into spring, although it hardly feels like it today, we hope that the renewal that always comes with spring would be true in each of your lives too. Thank you for participating, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.